Across borders and contexts. My name is Ann Rademacher. I'm part of the Environmental Studies program here, as well as the Metropolitan Studies program in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. And tonight's lecture is the third in a 4-lecture series where we're trying to work with sustainability as both concept and practice and address from different perspectives the challenges, both intellectual and pragmatic, that are conceptual and practice apparatus that we have in place for thinking about and doing sustainability or sustainability initiatives bring up. The series and sustainability as both a problem and a challenge are made possible in part or provoked in part by NYU's commitment, again, both rhetorical and practical, to enacting sustainability here on our campus at NYU and also in the ways that we conduct ourselves around the world. The bridge specifically to NYU Abu Dhabi, as many of you know, is that the Abu Dhabi site and program has made many stated commitments to honoring the overall university commitment to sustainability. In the built environment, in intellectual life, and in the community and cultural values that we foster and espouse as we move about the globe. NYU Abu Dhabi as well is trying right now to design a multidisciplinary concentration in environmental studies. And so this series is also part of the dialogue that we hope is informing the way that that concentration is thought about and designed. As I said, this is part of a 4-lecture series, and the 4th in the series, after tonight's lecture, will take place here at 19 Washington Square North on December 2nd, when we'll welcome Julie Z from the UC Davis program in environmental justice. She's going to be speaking on fantasies and fears, reading eco-city development in Shanghai, and we'll be dealing with the question of eco-cities in political and cultural context. We invite you to join us for that lecture. We welcome you to the lecture tonight. And that lecture is given by Greg Beckett, who joins us tonight from the University of Chicago, where he's Collegiate Assistant Professor and Harper Fellow. Professor Beckett received his PhD from the Anthropology Department at the University of Chicago in 2008. His dissertation, which is titled The End of Haiti, History Under Conditions of Impossibility, explores the cultural, historical, and political factors that have produced the so-called permanent crisis in Haiti. Moving beyond the frequent designations of Haiti as a crisis country, his research explores the social experience of disjuncture and disintegration, with a focus on the relationship between the material destruction of the environment and a politics of mourning that imagines the end or the death of Haiti as a viable nation state. Professor Beckett's scholarly interests include political ecology and the built environment, democracy, political imaginaries and the state, natural disaster and global emergency. He's currently working on a book manuscript, which is as yet untitled, or a title in progress, and that's based on his dissertation and on a number of articles exploring issues including U.S. military intervention in Haiti and humanitarian crises and disaster response. I want to ask, before we formally welcome him to the podium, that those of you that are willing, please sign in. Let us know that you're here. You'll notice that there are 2 sign-in sheets that are circulating. One has to do with a class that's taught in conjunction with this lecture series. So if you're here from the class, please sign in on the sheet that's labeled Ann's class. And if you're not affiliated with the class, please sign in on the sheet labeled Other. We are othering in so many ways. With that, I'd like to welcome Greg Beckett and thank him for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Anne, and thank all of you for coming. Good evening. I'm going to talk about a story of a project to make a botanic garden in Haiti. And when we're thinking about uniting concepts in theory with practice in terms of sustainability, I might as well tell you now so that you don't get frustrated by the end. My story is going to end in more or less failure. It's a story of a garden that didn't manage to become a garden in practice. And I think that I hope we can see something in this case, even though it's a case that's not illustrative of what to do. Hopefully we can see something in it worth talking about and thinking about. So be prepared for the story not to end so well. But I think we can use this as a starting point. The Catherine Dunham Botanic Garden in Haiti was officially listed with Botanic Gardens Conservation International in 1993. BGCI is a global network of botanic gardens and national parks that seeks to foster conservation, sustainable resource management, and the protection of biodiversity through the exchange of seeds and plants, data, technology, and expert knowledge. Support from BGCI and other international groups was key, as this fledgling botanic garden did not actually have any officially recognized institutional presence in Haiti itself. Indeed, the founders and sponsors of the garden project were very concerned to bypass the Haitian state and to forge an institution that was both committed to conservation and sustainability on the one hand, and specifically capable of uniting the local community living around the garden with an international global network of non-governmental actors and agencies. The garden project was located in Marizan, a once verdant middle-class suburb that's now become a sprawling slum on the southwestern edge of Haiti's capital city, Port-au-Prince. It's situated on a 45-acre estate that's been owned from the 1940s until about 2006, privately owned by the American dancer and anthropologist Catherine Dunham. After she passed away, the title went to her daughter. Spurred by the popular movements of the 1980s, Catherine Dunham hired a Canadian named Cameron Broman to establish and run what she called the Catherine Dunham Botanic Garden Foundation. While there was at times a tension in the very form of the project between the foreign ownership of a private estate and the botanic garden that was imagined as a public good, overall both Catherine Dunham and Cameron Broman had deep ties to the local community, and they were both well-known figures and well-liked in the area. In fact, in its initial few years, the garden project received widespread support from a variety of actors and groups in the country. The most prominent of these was the Cooperative Society for the Environment, a local grassroots organization created by a prominent family living in Marizan to protect a large and important underground watershed located in the area. The underground spring is capable, if properly protected and maintained, which it's not right now, but if it were, it's capable of supplying about 1/3 to 1/2 of the capital's drinking water. Since a key part of that watershed runs right under Dunham's property and the proposed garden site, where it emerges as a series of freshwater springs, protecting Dunham's estate was an absolute necessity if the spring itself is to be saved. Both the Cooperative Society and the Dunham Foundation were formed in the late 1980s at the beginning of Haiti's long and what some now call its unending transition to democracy. Given the wider political context, the proponents of the garden project were initially aligned with the democratic movement as a whole, and quite specifically with the figure of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, one of the leading figures of the popular movement. Catherine Dunham herself personally knew Aristide and went on a hunger strike in support of him when he was kicked out by a coup in 1991. So they were explicitly aligned with Aristide and the democratic movement, and also explicitly directly opposed to the authoritarian and military governments that ruled Haiti during this period. The Dunham Foundation thus sought to base its own support at the local level, using connections to grassroots popular movements and community groups, and at the global level to international scientific networks or apolitical conservation groups, and to, again, explicitly bypass the Haitian state, which they characterized as both lacking in capacity to protect the area, and perhaps more importantly, as lacking any legitimacy to do so. When it was first created, the Catherine Dunham Botanic Garden, at least first created on paper, was envisioned as a resource center for botanic science, as well as a place for biodiversity conservation and a cultural institution that would engage in environmental education and outreach in the local community. There were plans at various stages to run a school on the property, or to at least have a field research station for a local high school to run classes on agronomy and environmentalism. Beyond such practical matters, the garden was also imagined by its planners as a symbol of hope and as a space that would give visible and tangible form to what in Haiti during the democratic period was called Yon Lot Haiti, or another Haiti, a future in which the many crises from ecological, political, and economic to the social would be resolved. The Garden Project itself and the overall practices and discourses of the Dunham Foundation were only one example of a widespread sentiment in Haiti that confronting the environmental crisis was central to even the possibility of building a democratic society in the country. So both sustainability and democracy were united, and in part because they both hinge on ensuring institutions and practices that make possible a durable future. Concrete attempts to deal with the environment were thus framed as a vital and urgent necessity. And this sense of urgency is actually widely felt in Haiti, where there's a widespread consensus that the country has one of the most degraded environments in the world. Accurate measures are difficult to obtain, but it's clear that the rates of deforestation and soil erosion have increased steadily from the 1970s onward. Despite numerous reforestation campaigns by international aid agencies who have literally planted tens of millions of trees over the past few decades, the country loses an estimated 3% of forest coverage and 15,000 acres of arable land each year. Only about 1% of natural forest coverage remains, and only a small fraction of any land area is under formal state protection. The few national parks that are under state management have largely remained intact, if at all. I mean, to the extent that they are intact, they've only remained so due to their extremely isolated locations. Park management has suffered in recent decades from the corruption of park rangers and from the state's lack of funds or commitment to protect them, as well as from rampant illegal logging. While deforestation and soil erosion remain the biggest threats, the country also faces widespread drought and desertification, and has recently been rated the most water-poor country in the world, with large portions of the population lacking access to clean drinking water. On top of that, there's issues of the overuse of land, population pressure, and soil exhaustion, which combined to create chronic food shortages in the country. While the depth and breadth of the environmental crisis has long been recognized, it did not enter into public discourse until the era of the democratic transition, that is, after the fall of the Duvalier family dictatorship in 1986, when it became finally politically feasible to discuss such matters. Given this historical context, environmental movements in Haiti have been deeply tied to the wider popular movements of the 80s and 90s, and they have been informed by the same kind of theory that informed the democratic practice, which in the Haitian case has largely been some kind of nexus of Marxism and liberation theology. The Botanic Garden Project was influenced by the emancipatory projects of the democratic era, and its proponents saw a clear link between the resolution of the environmental crisis and the restoration of a new moral and political order. Members of the Dunham Foundation and the Cooperative Society routinely noted that the country's environmental problems were merely the most visible effects of the exploitation and domination of global capital and authoritarian state forms. They argued that dependency and dictatorship had produced a recursive system of poverty and environmental degradation that forced peasants to engage in what they called ecologically irrational behavior, such as charcoal production or logging. It's a long cycle, one of the Development Foundation members told me in a meeting in 2002. People are poor, so they cut trees to make money, and they just keep getting poorer. Lying behind the Botanic Garden Project, then, was a wider analysis that framed the Haitian environmental crisis as part of a wider global crisis, and indeed the Haitian case was understood as a symptom of deep structural contradictions in both the world system and in Haitian society itself. For the Dunham Foundation, peasants simply had no choice but to use up resources through destructive practices. The paradigmatic example of this was what Foundation Director Cameron Broman called the, quote, one-off economic value of trees, end quote, cut for sale as fuel wood or charcoal. Cameron was highly critical of this kind of commoditization of nature, in part because it had so clearly led to the overuse of natural resources. He countered the pure exchange value of natural resources with what he called a, quote, sustainable model based on the use value or ecological value, that's his term as well, of trees and other resources. Trees aren't mere commodities, Cameron told me. Some things are beyond market prices. What about the medicinal value of trees and plants, the value of fruit trees, end quote. For Cameron, the foregrounding of these alternative regimes of value formed part of what he called a culturally salient model for resource management. Cameron repeatedly differentiated the Botanic Garden project from other development projects that focused on short-term reforestation campaigns. The garden was imagined as a long-term solution to the crisis, one that would be based on the establishment of a new ecological order in which human-human or economic and human-environment or ecological relations would be completely transformed. The central question at the core of the project, then, was the issue of the community of the future. For Haiti to be reborn, it was necessary to build democratic and sustainable social, economic, political, and ecological relations. And the garden was meant to both signify, and in a more important sense, to actually help bring about this new political and moral order. Well, the Dunham Foundation and the Cooperative Society presented the Botanic Garden as a national asset that would be of perpetual value to an imagined community of the future. They liked to call it a gift to the Haitian people. They did not see it as a gift to the Haitian state, which was deemed unable to manage and protect the nation's resources. Indeed, members of both groups recalled time and again how the Duvalier dictatorship and the military juntas that followed in its wake had contributed to land seizures and clear-cutting in the national parks. Thus, while they intended the garden to be a symbol of national regeneration, they felt that the institution as such could only operate successfully if it was linked to an international network of research centers. Thus, the Botanic Garden project was envisioned as a mode of intervention and an institutional form capable of restoring harmonious and reciprocal relations between people and the environment. While there was a clear commitment to the Botanic Garden as a spatial form and to sustainability and conservation as social practice, the project was also founded on a peculiar mixture of the personal interests of Catherine Dunham and Cameron Broman. Both of them saw Dunham's estate as a place worth saving, and they turned to the Botanic Garden as an established institutional form that they could sort of draw on that would allow them to connect the issues of Martisan and Haiti to a broader audience and a broader network of actors and agencies. The project began then with an effort to match the desirable, saving this property, and the feasible, drawing on an established form like a garden, and it was thought that the private ownership of the property would provide a more secure basis for the creation and maintenance of what was ultimately going to be a public good. Beyond the private ownership of the site, the garden's location in Martisan resulted in a number of intended and unintended outcomes. On the one hand, it was a good site for a project that sought to unite conservation efforts on the local and the global level. This is not just because Port-au-Prince is Haiti's capital city or its largest city, and it contains at least a quarter of the population, but also because Port-au-Prince is the center of national political life and thus a key site for the flow of development aid and for connections to the government, to non-government organizations, and to international aid organizations. A botanic garden research site located in the capital would thus actually allow for partnerships with those organizations as well as with universities. It would allow for, or so it was imagined, greater oversight from donors and better protection and security. On the other hand, the project's location did not sit very well with those focused on rural development in Haiti, who want to just sort of ignore the problem of Port-au-Prince altogether and deal with what they call the real Haiti of the countryside. For over 60 years, there's been a long tradition of development efforts based in the countryside where the issues of deforestation, food security, soil erosion, and the collapse of the peasant base are quite pressing. Some development experts in Haiti were ambivalent about the relevance of a botanic garden, and instead they tended to advocate not for conservation at all, but rather for the forging of a new commitment to peasant farming based on fast-growing plants that could be used to make charcoal, which is certainly the number one cash crop in the country. A space of preservation and conservation did not fit then with the dominant idea among people working in the countryside, at least, that there was simply no nature left in Haiti to protect. From its inception, the garden project drew its most sustained support then from long-term residents who had lived in Martisan for more than 3 or 4 decades. These long-term So it drew its most sustained support from long-term residents in Martisan who saw in it the promise not only of scientific management of plant species, but also, more crucially, the protection of the neighborhood as a whole, especially the underground water supply. The issue of the water supply had been a concern of residents for decades, and beyond protecting the garden site, which they all agreed was an urgent necessity, they also hoped that the project would finally force the state and municipal authorities to enforce basic urban planning and zoning laws and to prohibit the rapid expansion of auto-constructed settlements and slum communities in the area. As Sabine Manigat has noted, Port-au-Prince has a rather particular kind of history. The aging infrastructure was designed for a city only a fraction the size of the current population, and there's been no sustained effort to rebuild the old areas or to build new infrastructure, with a few possible exceptions of some rudimentary public housing built by governments and designed for their supporters. At the same time, the city has drawn rural migrants fleeing the collapse of the agricultural sector, and wave after wave of migration from the 1930s onward has significantly transformed the city. As Manigat argues, quote, "Urban problems have grown and now escape all administrative controls, overwhelming maintenance capacities and completely rewriting the patterns by which urban space is occupied," end quote. In Manigat's telling phrase, and it's actually one that's repeated in many various formulations throughout Martezan, throughout Port-au-Prince, quoting Manigat, "The entire city of Port-au-Prince has acquired the physiognomy of a slum, making the center of national political life a strange symbol of the absence of the state and its utter lack of capacity." Reacting to the recent wave of rural to urban migration, especially the most recent one began in the 80s and hasn't really stopped, long-term residents of Martezan were anxious about what they called the slumification of their community. This anxiety was shared by the leaders of both the Dunham Foundation and the Cooperative Society, all of whom also lived in the area. The Garden Project was thus always also concerned with the issues of urbanization, slums, and the enormous drain on resources, especially on water, that this process of ad hoc urbanization entails. In addition, the conceptual core of the project, a public conservation effort driven by private citizens, entailed both a commitment to bypass the state and a critique of the state's lack of capacity. This approach made sense in the 1980s and early 90s when the Haitian state was authoritarian, anti-democratic, and unconstitutional in nature. But over time, the project's planners and supporters, especially the long-term residents in Martezan, began to worry not just about the state's weakness or illegitimacy, but also about what they referred to as the potentially anti-democratic aspects of the nation, that is, the citizenry itself. These anxieties increased as a tense standoff and eventual conflict emerged between the long-term residents and recent migrants, many of whom were squatters living on private or state land. While a new wave of rural-urban migration was sparked by the deepening crisis in rural Haiti, the issue of squatting and slumification took on new significance in Martezan in the mid-1980s. It was during this period that squatters began to settle on portions of Dunham's estate, as well as on nearby public land. It was also during this period that the urban poor were increasingly figured as violent, dangerous, and politically volatile in public discourse, both in Martezan and throughout the capital. As the criminalization of the poor took hold in the new political imaginary of the democratic era, policing and security took on heightened meaning. By the late 90s and early 2000s, those who could afford to do so were moving out of Martezan, selling off their houses, or simply abandoning them and heading to the distant gated communities in the hills above the capital. Most residents were unable to do this, however, and those who remained became increasingly nostalgic for the bygone era of the Duvalier dictatorship. The core of this nostalgia was the perceived linkage between a so-called strong state of the dictatorship and the retroactively reimagined stability or security of everyday life. I think it's an incredibly romanticized kind of nostalgia to recall the Duvalier dictatorship as stable or secure. For example, one resident, Gabrielle, told me in 2003, quote, "These people come here and they have nothing, no jobs, no houses, but they want everything," end quote. An elderly mulatto man of about 70, Gabrielle was a doctor and writer who lived in Martezan all his life. A portion of his property had been taken over by squatters, and he had since hired private security to protect his house. Like many others associated with the project, and indeed like many other long-term residents living in Martezan, Gabrielle recalled the Duvalier era as a time of stability, and he also felt that Aristide, who was then president at the time that Gabrielle was speaking, had proven to be a terrible leader, what he called a political beast, who violated the law and encouraged class warfare. For Gabrielle, the chaos of contemporary Haiti was a direct result of Aristide's politics and the lack of political consciousness and political conscience among his supporters. Political consciousness and conscience are his terms, many of whom were precisely the new migrants, squatters, and urban poor whose presence so worried Gabrielle and others. Within this context, the presence of a growing squatter community at the Botanic Gardens site was seen as a telling example of the breakdown of the rule of law. Gabrielle and others often referred to the squatters and urban poor as outsiders, That is, as a class of people who were not exactly foreign, but who were cast as alien, hostile, and illegitimate. For their part, the squatters and urban poor in Martezan and elsewhere were drawn to Aristide's political discourse, in which it was precisely the poor and excluded, whom Aristide called the people, that defined the nation. It was the explosion of slums and the takeover of urban space by the poor that became, by the 90s, the most concrete symbol of the break between the intellectual and professional middle classes, of whom people like Gabriel were a part, and Aristide and the popular movement. Before this time, there had been a kind of a unification of these groups, and by the 90s, the late 90s, they had begun to fracture. The Dunham Foundation was keenly aware of this situation, and the initial development plan for the garden included a commitment to relocating and compensating the squatters. The project planners also recognized the pressing need for land among the urban poor, and they tried to both bring the squatters into the project directly to help make them participants in planning the garden, and they also tried to mediate between the interests of long-term residents and squatters. In the first decade of the project, the Dunham Foundation expected the main source of conflict between the garden itself, established residents, and the squatters would be access to water. They knew that the garden would need a lot of water, and that public access to water would be a key issue in the community. As part of their educational and promotional efforts, they thus tried to present the case for the garden to all residents, squatters and formal alike, and they tried to show how the garden itself would help protect the spring, thereby guaranteeing fresh water for everyone now and in the future. The Cooperative Society, as a grassroots community-based organization, was actually quite instrumental in helping to make the case for the garden, and in the early years of the project, water never actually emerged as an issue of conflict or competition. Water is, however, a deeply political issue in Haiti, and the urban poor often rally around such issues as housing, water, and food as basic rights. Under the Duvalier dictatorship, water management was one of the many prebends of political officials who would often charge for access to public standpipes or steal water from public access points to bottle it for resale later. In the 90s, the newly elected democratic government, headed by Jean-Bertrand Aristide, built new standpipes and reopened and repaired existing ones in an attempt to democratize access to water. One of the new standpipes was located in a large squatter settlement that was right beside the garden site. Many in Martezan saw the existence of standpipes and the lack of policing as a clear sign that the squatters would never be removed by the state. For their part, many of the squatters argued that they actually had a right to live there. They did not see themselves as outsiders who had unlawfully taken private property or who had moved into an area where they did not belong. Rather, they saw themselves as part of a community, and they established strong ties fairly quickly to other residents living in the area. This is, I think, a fairly common story in many cities of the global south. In such contexts, a group of squatters becomes a community precisely through their collective occupation of an area. Land therefore becomes the basis for a kind of moral community, and the threat of eviction or expulsion provides the basis for a political community united against private individuals and the police. As Partha Chatterjee has noted in a quite different context, the central issue from the point of view of political rights is that squatter communities are founded on a fundamental violation of legality and civic order. Squatters have occupied and taken over state or private land for personal use. Squatters thus live in a tense relationship with the state and the law. The continued existence of squatter communities is always provisional and contextual, and alliances and affiliations with political parties or other government institutions and sites of power are necessary, even if highly contingent. While such groups may be on the margins of the law, they are at the same time located at the center of public life and are both, I think, structurally necessary to contemporary urban reality and highly visible throughout modern cityscapes. The issue of squatters is part of the broader issue, I think, at least in Haiti, of state capacity. As I noted earlier, in Port-au-Prince in particular, the expansion of slums and squatter settlements is seen as a clear sign of the state's inability to govern. By the mid-90s and after, however, the issue of squatters and a kind of combined issue of what are called in Haiti gangs, using a borrowing of the English term, I'll come back to gangs in a moment, but the issue of squatters and gangs raised new anxieties about the state and the democratic transition. At the core of these new anxieties was the fear that, in seeking to make concessions to its popular base among the urban poor, the government would grant land rights to squatters or provide settlements with services like electricity and water, which would at least tacitly legitimize their property claims. In this sense, the democratic transition brought new concerns about the state's role in sustainability and about the nation's or the people's capacity or perhaps incapacity to act democratically. The emergent struggle to define and control the garden site gave concrete expression to the question of inclusion and exclusion, and to the often tense relation between basic human rights on the one hand, things like food, water, and housing, and what we might call modern political rights on the other, things like property or personal security. Thus, while the Dunham Foundation and the Cooperative Society saw the garden as a natural resource that needed to be managed and protected by both scientific experts and property law, those living in the squatter community saw it as a kind of national or public land to which they claimed access, precisely because they were part of the nation or the public. Thus, the presence of a squatter community on the garden site was about more than the violation of law or the criminal seizure of private property. It was also about two quite different ideas of community and political inclusion. Given the involvement of foreigners and elites in the garden project, these different ideas of access and inclusion were often refracted into the more general opposition between the rights of the people as a national political community and the fairly long-standing tradition in Haiti of elite dismissal of the people as a kind of illegitimate mass incapable of rational political action. The contrast between these two democratic imaginaries was drawn into sharp relief around a new security threat that emerged in the 1990s, the marked presence of urban gangs in the slums of Port-au-Prince. In the mid-90s, as tensions between long-term residents, the garden planners, and squatters were heating up, an armed group calling itself the Red Army moved into the area and took control of the garden site. Lacking funding and direct control over much of the property, the Dunham Foundation launched what it called a rescue phase, during which they worked not to conserve nature or foster sustainable development, but rather just to quite literally save the property itself from what they saw as the violent predation of the Red Army and the squatters. The exact form and nature of the connection between the Red Army and the squatters is difficult to determine, but by the time the Foundation launched the rescue phase, its members were convinced that the squatters and gangs were a united front and that both groups were aligned with, or at least had the tacit support of, the state. Some members of the squatter community had publicly claimed as much, and after taking over the property, the Red Army made this link clear when they painted signs on the property featuring their name, political slogans in support of President Aristide, as well as threats to foreigners. The Red Army also killed several residents living near the garden, and they repeatedly made public threats against members of the Dunham Foundation and the Cooperative Society. The police eventually arrested one of the leaders of the gang, but many in Martezan felt that the police and the government seemed both unwilling and unable to actually enforce the law. The situation with the Red Army was but one example of a rampant problem, as armed gangs increasingly became de facto rulers of streets, blocks, and entire neighborhoods throughout Port-au-Prince. For some, these emergent garrison communities provided further evidence of the state's failure, since it no longer had the capacity to provide the fundamental political good of security. For others, it was evidence of the state's complicity with the gangs. Regardless, the militarization of the slums was a significant turning point in the national political crisis, which really, the most recent one starts in 2000 and still going on. The existence of entrepreneurial gangs operating as both the armed wing of the state or of political parties and as autonomous actors without direct ideological commitment became a central issue in the struggle between President Aristide, who was in his second presidential term in 2000 until a coup kicked him out in 2004, a struggle between Aristide and a range of opposition groups. The political crisis that began in 2000, during the political crisis that began in 2000, these opposition groups coalesced into two sort of big categories. One was a political opposition group. There was a coalition of political parties that had nothing in common except rejection of Aristide. And the other was a group that called itself a civil society opposition that mobilized groups like the Dunham Foundation to advocate for Aristide to step down or for some sort of power-sharing agreement. So during the political crisis in 2000, the civil society and political opposition backed by sectors of the international community linked the proliferation of gangs and violence directly to Aristide himself, accusing him of arming and funding a network of criminal political gangs of which the Red Army was considered to be a part. This period marked a major transition in the practice and politics of the Dunham Foundation. They were no longer able to negotiate or work with the squatters, and they weren't really interested in doing it anyway at this point. But the Red Army had effectively blocked any connections with the squatters themselves, and the Red Army had presented themselves as actually articulating the interests of the squatters. The Dunham Foundation was also increasingly convinced that the gang had direct ties to members of the municipal and national governments. One prominent rumor in the area was that the then mayor of Port-au-Prince hoped to take the property over for himself and was using the gangs to facilitate this. The foundation soon stopped even calling on the national police, who were heavily aligned with the Aristide government, to protect the area, and instead joined with the political opposition in calling for Aristide to step down. In this sense, the Botanic Garden project became completely bound up with the wider political crisis, with the garden site no longer serving as a symbol of hope for a restored nature or nation, but rather as a symbol of the depth and extent of the state's incapacity and illegitimacy. In 2002, the Dunham Foundation circulated a memo called the Situation Report that outlined in succinct detail the key points that were to form the basis of a sort of public relations campaign that they launched as part of this rescue phase. They were trying to draw the attention of the international community in particular to the conflict at the Botanic Garden site. The language of the report crystallizes a key aspect of the rescue phase during which the conceptual core of the garden project switched from conservation to security. The report begins by describing the garden site as a, quote, unique remnant, end quote, of old-growth coastal rainforest that is, quote, surrounded by an urban slum, and it is in fact both of those things. From the start, the report framed the property as a natural space in need of protection from the social disorder of unplanned, unregulated, and unruly urban sprawl, the sort of sea of Shantytown around it. So the report begins by opposing nature and society. Next, the report declared that the garden was being, quoting from the report again, held hostage by vicious criminals who terrorize the community and prevent the citizens of Port-au-Prince from using and enjoying their only botanic garden, end quote. So here, the opposition between nature and society was extended and converted into a struggle between citizens and criminals, each contending for control over a public good. Presented in this way, the situation required not just a commitment to save or protect a natural space, but an active intervention to wrest control of the garden back from the Red Army and the squatters. Violence, illegality, and invasion was thus opposed to legitimate interests of the rightful users of the Botanic Garden, the so-called national community. Having established that the law had been violated and that a national good and a national interest was at stake, the report then noted that the Haitian government could not resolve the situation. Quoting from the report again, in most countries, this precious environmental resource would be deemed a national treasure, a vital educational asset for generations of students and a powerful symbol of hope for a people beset with social unrest and economic chaos. Sadly, the Haitian government is so gripped by internal problems, it's unable to commit to rescue this garden, end quote. The report continues, noting that the government and police are not only unable to commit to protecting the area, but are also unwilling to do so. If the state could not provide the public good of security, either due to lack of capacity or corruption, or perhaps both, then the only way to save the garden would be through private funding or support from the international community. After outlining the extent of the problem and the need for intervention from private citizens and international agencies, the report transposed the issue of property invasion, or security, back again into the framework of natural resources that ought to be protected and managed as a public good, or back into the language of conservation. Quoting from the report again, the Botanic Garden sits atop an artesian spring, the source of drinking water for much of western Port-au-Prince. The two aquifers that give this city its potable water supply are measurably drying up due to massive deforestation of the surrounding mountains. It is estimated that Port-au-Prince has less than 10 years of water left. In such scarcity, water is political. This forest and its springs nourish the life of this entire city. The Haitian Ministry of the Environment has made the initial effort to decree it a protected site, but they cannot protect it, end quote. The implication here is that under normal circumstances, government agencies like the Ministry of the Environment would protect such important sites, but given the wider political crisis, they cannot do so. Under such conditions, water is political, and the proper management of resources that have the capacity to nourish the capital must be protected from those who would seize them for unlawful or personal gain. The question at the heart of the report, then, is the struggle over the legitimate claim to use, own, and have access to natural resources and public goods. The implication, amplified in the various media campaigns undertaken by the Dunham Foundation, was that the gangs and the squatters were holding these resources, and not just a private estate, hostage. So if the state couldn't deal with saving the garden, what kind of institutions could? Well, the report basically appealed to three different kinds of communities that might come into play and to save the garden. The first was the international community of conservation groups. So we're going back to their commitment to align the garden project with organizations like Botanic Gardens Conservation International. They wanted a scientific management, apolitical kind of system to rule or to administrate the park. The second was the international community more broadly, especially those organizations committed to good governance and security in the region. They specifically appealed to the Organization of American States, which they hoped could both ideally provide sources of funding to the project or help unblock aid that would make the project sort of come back together. And finally, they appealed to what they framed as the actual real community of Martezan, mostly the long-term residents of the area. They were thus denying that the squatters had any role to play in saving or establishing the garden at this point. So we can see in the situation report the maturation of the logic at the core of the garden project. If in the first years of the garden project they had imagined it as being based on a kind of radical hope, its final years were based on an equally radical disillusionment. Frustrated by the lack of government response to the rescue phase, the foundation became highly critical of Aristide and joined with the civil society opposition in calling for his removal. Their primary concern was the breakdown of the rule of law and what they saw as rampant political corruption and violence. This focus on security had a significant impact on the practices and policies of the group's members and supporters on the ground, as the foundation began to turn away from the squatter community as a whole and to embrace the position of the long-term residents who ultimately wanted to evict the squatters from the neighborhood. And the Dunham Foundation also at this time turned to hiring local residents as a private security force to patrol the area. The foundation's director, Cameron, explained this transformation to me in the following terms, quoting Cameron: "We wanted to plant trees throughout the country when we started. Now we have to guard them with guns. When we started this thing, it was meant to be a model for conservation for the whole country. Now we're just trying to save it." In the years following the situation report, the security situation in Haiti as a whole, and especially in Martezan, worsened significantly. In 2003, a high-profile gang from a large slum in the coastal city of Gonaïves took control of that city, and then over the next 6 months or so launched what they called a popular rebellion, which most people would characterize as a coup that ultimately removed Aristide from power in February of 2004. Following Aristide's removal, the civil society opposition, joined together and backed by the international community, created what they called a Council of Sages to appoint a new provisional or emergency government, an unconstitutional government, which governed Haiti from 2004 to 2006. In 2004, there was also a UN stabilization mission sent to Haiti, which is still there. And the provisional government from 2004 to 2006, at least as some critics have it, used the police and the UN forces to essentially attack Aristide's supporters in the urban slums. Perhaps a more neutral way to say it is that there was a direct confrontation between gangs and the security forces on the ground. But in Martezan, there was daily fighting. Martezan was one of three main zones of insecurity. There was daily fighting between the gangs, the police, and the UN from 2004 to 2006 or 2007. The Dunham Foundation greeted the provisional government and the UN intervention with a renewed optimism, hoping that a robust policing campaign to remove the gang and the squatters would ensue. They even offered the garden site to the UN as a base of operations, although their offer was declined. Yet, as the emergency period grew longer, the conflict between the state and the gangs dragged on. The Red Army actually became more entrenched in Martezan and fought harder to defend its territory. They set houses on fire, forcing residents to flee the area, and they blocked roads with burning barricades and other materials, extending the logic of the Garrison community to its limit. So by 2006, the foundation was worried that the garden project may have actually come to an end. And in fact, in terms of its formulation as the Botanic Garden Foundation, it did. At the same time that this was happening, Catherine Dunham passed away, and there was a legal battle over the control of her property. Her will gave this most significant portion of it to the foundation, which decided to give the property over to the Haitian government, the unconstitutional provisional government, and to dissolve the foundation itself. So just at the moment when the security situation was perhaps going to turn around with the UN mission in the country, the foundation seemed to reverse its 20-year-long commitment to bypassing the state and forging a local, global nexus, and converted the property into state property. So the Catherine Dunham Botanic Garden Foundation is actually not called that anymore. It's now been labeled Parc Mardesan and folded into the system of national parks run by the state, the very same system that the foundation criticized for 2 decades. The state was unable to manage adequately and protect. And I think this is kind of a strange ending for this project in a sense. And in fact, I think it's a considerable compromise on part of the government, on part of the Botanic Garden planners. From its inception, the garden project sought to build a network of actors and an institutional form that specifically did not work through the Haitian state, because in the initial years, the project's planners did not view the state as legitimate and as capable of conservation or sustainable development, mainly because it wasn't democratic. Under Aristide, they continued to critique the state and try to bypass it, but this time their language switched to suggesting that the Aristide government was too democratic, as their phrasing, that Aristide gave the people too much democracy. What they were really concerned with was Aristide's political discourse, which seemed to legitimize the public seizure of private goods. So giving the project over to an unconstitutional state, and by 2006, there was a return to a constitutional government under René Préval, who is still the current president. Even if one imagines that they thought the state was somehow legitimate and could handle this project, nothing about the state's capacity had changed. In fact, the state's capacity had largely weakened in this period. And so it's a real odd compromise to give a project over to a state that you've been saying can't or won't protect this area in any significant way. And I think I'll just end on this note, because I think it's time to start moving towards the Q&A period. But what I really think is happening in the end of this project is a switch not just from conservation to security as the main concern among the planners of the Botanic Garden project, but ultimately really a concern with what I would call a kind of policing ecology. I think that what the national park system does, if anything, if it's even going to save the property, is really just going to enclose it and separate it from the people in the neighborhood. And that's only going to be managed by the police, or in this case, probably by the UN for as long as they're in Haiti. And so turning to sustainability backed by policing seems to me to potentially undermine the very idea of sustainability and sustainable development, which I think really needs to find a way of uniting spatial forms like botanic gardens or national parks with sustainable practices on the ground, with a real commitment to social practice. So I would say that really by foregrounding policing and trying to keep conservation and sustainability, this turn at the end of the project really gave up the commitment, any commitment to democracy as a social practice that would be a meaningful component of sustainability. So I think I'll just end there. I mean, I had a larger conclusion that I don't want to get into, and open it up for questions and answers about the case itself, or about how we can use this case to think about things that one might want to do if this is a case of sort of what not to do. It certainly doesn't immediately lend itself to something that we want to replicate in other contexts, I don't think. So perhaps we should turn it over to Q&A.
Thank you, Greg. There's so much to think about here that I fear I could go on too long with my questions. I actually have some general conceptual queries about the relationship between civil society and political society in charities, since you mentioned that. But I'll leave that aside for the moment.
Sure.
And focus on two, I hope, more specific questions. First, I was really struck by your presentation of conservation/sustainability, and actually a very simple question is whether or not those are synonymous terms in your presentation. But conservation and sustainability on the one hand, and security on the other as both inherently desirable goods that therefore should be politically achieved, but at the same time might potentially come into contradiction with each other. So I was wondering in particular whether there's a different logic by which both conservation and security come to be seen as obligations and therefore potentially failures of the state on one hand, and obligations and therefore potentially failures of the international community on the other. So does that essentially make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first general question, whereby what is the logic by which both conservation and security are thought to be state obligations and potential failures, and international communities' obligations and failures on the other hand? Secondly, even though it's clear that the garden has in some sense ceased to exist and become a garrison, I was struck by your conceptualization of it as both a means to and a metaphor for and of a desirable political community. So taking that metaphor, if it's fair to take that metaphor to a bit further, who would be the gardener?
Yeah.
Or what would be the gardener? Of course, the garrison doesn't need to be gardener.
No.
Maybe it should be.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, to maybe work backwards, I mean, who or what the gardener would be, what's the agency collecting this, is an interesting one. I mean, I think that in the case of botanic gardens that actually exist, the scientific community becomes the kind of the new active agency that's apolitical, but it's a kind of expert knowledge that gathers these things together. The long history of botanic gardens is an interesting one that I think is kind of telling, given a case like Haiti anyway. I mean, there are colonial institutions. Historically, they emerge in the context of European empires as places to collect and protect economically valuable resources deemed valuable within the colonial context. So they also are kind of overlaid with longer history of European gardens that are really about collecting the species scattered at the fall into a prelapsarian whole. So one early 15th, 16th century idea of gardens is that God is the gardener, and now we have this secularized version of some sort of expert knowledge. And I think that the level of the Botanic Garden is really trying to figure a way to make that a global expert knowledge. But the problem is Botanic Gardens as institutional forms are really stuck with the fact that there no longer are global networks, or they're only networks of information, let's say, and seed trade, but they really must always be managed at the local level within the form of the nation state. And that's something that's significant in the 20th century, where after decolonization, after World War II largely, and the breakdown of European overseas empires, Botanic Gardens became national sites, not colonial sites. And so the nation state becomes a kind of important intermediary state in the regulations. The gardens get folded into patrimony, national space, a national landscape, not just a natural one. And so the national community is what the Dunham Garden thought would be the gardener. Really, of course, throughout most of the 20 years of the project, Catherine Dunham was thought by people to be the gardener in the sense that she owned the property. She was an American dancer and choreographer, but among other things, she was also an anthropologist, and she had been initiated into voodoo and was a high priest in the voodoo hierarchy. So she quite literally was both the property owner or the head of the property in Haitian terminology and the spiritual owner of the property. So there's a lot of kind of symbolism, religion, politics in there, but the project itself, as people like Cameron Broman saw it, would be managed by the national community, which they never really defined, right? And that's part of the tension, because Aristide defined the national community as the people, which would include the squatters. So the squatters can say things like, if it's a national community running the garden, well, that's us, right? And we're going to live here and protect it. So that became ultimately the destabilizing issue. And that actually goes into some of the other questions about conservation and security being founded on a contradiction, or perhaps being contradictory. I think that they are absolutely contradictory, and I think that the reason they're contradictory is that conservation especially, but I think also sustainability projects, are what David Harvey calls utopianisms, or utopian spatial forms. And we imagine particular kinds of spatial forms like a botanic garden or a national park or some other kind of form that can be put into place And especially the conservation language there is that it's going to stay that way or save something, right? Not really change. Yet these institutional forms, these spatial forms, have to exist in the midst of social life, which means that they're inevitably going to come into contact with and potentially conflict with just a social historical process of change. So unless you link up a spatial form with a social practice that's going to change the form itself as the community changes, then you're going to get eventually a contradiction between these two things. And as David Harvey presents it, spatial forms are almost invariably undone by the various social processes they seek to change. In this case, the garden is meant to produce a new order in the community, and it's of course swallowed whole by disorder in the community. And then I guess finally the obligation of the state, whether security or conservation are obligations of the state, certainly this is a significant shift of the post-Cold War period, what Mark Duffield calls the new security paradigm, in which the idea of a, quote, liberal peace or good governance is really going to be mediated by successful states. So weak states and failed states become a common language. Failed states are ones that we have to intervene into and do some sort of state building projects. Haiti has, for many years, been, there's a sort of typology of failed states and collapsed states. Haiti's got its own category of perennially weak state, which by 2004, people were ready to admit that it had actually become failed, and thus we get an intervention. But a weak state, you don't intervene into. It's not quite bad enough. It's like Haiti's always sort of circling the rim, about to fall in. And in 2004, it seemed like it did. So you get the international community uses a language like failed states to actually discursively justify the violation of national sovereignty and invade countries. So it actually is both an obligation of the state and an obligation of the international community as an interstate system that rests on states providing security. Because if states don't provide security, you get perhaps the exportation of insecurity, terrorism, those kinds of things. It bleeds out past these borders. So if the state can't do it, the international community comes in and does it. And that's why, so I think there's a tension there in the obligation. But I think that by and large, the post-war Cold War period is imagined as one in which states have to, at root, provide security and then other goods on top of that. And the appeal to that kind of framework among long-term residents of Martezan was that that's the main thing we want. The state can't do it, so let's support the UN mission and let's support the unconstitutional emergency government as a sort of strong state, strong really meaning that there's a commitment to policing as a state practice, and nothing more, right? So it's a complete rejection that the state should be doing anything else to provide for its citizens except policing. I don't know if that gets at all of them, but... Yes, hi.
My question has to do with the shortage of water. I'm sure that the decline of the garden could be traced over time. I'm sure it just didn't happen when you chronicled some of the events. But in regards to water shortage, I'm sure we just don't wake up and say, well, that's empty. So could you enlighten us as to what measures have been put in place over some period of time, or initiatives that have been put to tap water, let's say, by sinking wells, things of that nature, to resolve the problem? But to wake up today and to have a chronic water shortage seems unbelievable.
Yes.
To say the least.
Well, there's both a shortage and a shortage of clean water in particular. So even if there's public standpipes, and the government's main commitment in the past, since about the late 70s, early 80s, when the Duvalier dictatorship was really forced by international pressure to finally do a few things, like put in public standpipes and that kind of thing, drill new wells, find more access to water. Some of that has happened, so there's been some commitment to just building the infrastructure for water supply. Not nearly enough for the population of Port-au-Prince, let alone for the countryside where most people have to collect source water, rainwater, that kind of thing. But the real issue of water in Haiti is one of scarcity of clean water. It's got some of the most polluted water, polluted by human waste and garbage in particular in the slums. There's no separation of sewage systems and sanitation systems because these slums are ad hoc, auto-constructed. So that's really the most significant problem. There is these sources like this spring that aren't being tapped enough. The government's just really simply, one possible explanation is the government simply hasn't done enough of this and needs more funding to invest in water infrastructure. Another standard critique is that the government's been doing it, but the municipal water supply system in Port-au-Prince in particular is just too corrupt. And so the debate in contemporary Haiti is whether these kinds of services just need to be privatized so that they actually get done, which is a difficult thing because it's clear the state's not doing them. But there's, I think a lot of people are wary about privatizing these services because if they're public, there's a commitment for them to be free. If they're privatized, they'll cost something, and the population just can't afford it. So that becomes the main issue now. The other issue is just the widespread drought and rivers drying up just because of the ecological damage of the countryside, which is quite severe. So it's a separate kind of issue, but affecting the countryside and water access there. Is that?
Yeah.
Yep. Yes.
I was wondering, in light of Haiti's history and political climate, and also taking into consideration sustainable initiatives and the hope that we tend to attach to those initiatives, what do you think is the site of hope in Haiti?
It's a tough one. Very tough one. I think that a lot of people who work on development, conservation, environmental issues in Haiti, as well as other issues, Haitian and foreign, working in the country, are at a juncture where we're really concerned that there might not be any hope left. Right? I've gone through phases of thinking that myself, especially working fairly hard to help this botanic garden come about and watching the project not work out so well. I think it's important to have hope, and it's important not for us not to give up hope on Haiti or for Haitians. But in terms of what practically, where one would look in Haiti today for something that's kind of hopeful in terms of sustainable or conservation efforts, there are small-scale community-based groups in the countryside trying to do this themselves. And I think if you could get funding and some expertise and some basic infrastructure to some of the rural areas, you could support that and extend it. So there's models out there for community-controlled forests, for example, that they're completely replanted forests, but they're fruit trees that would be given to every member in the kind of a cooperative forest where everyone comes together, brings in some capital, plants trees, and then everyone draws from the fruit of those trees, as it were. And I think that very small-scale kinds of things like that, where the community most directly affected becomes the driving participatory force, is really the only kind of solution we could build in a place like Haiti right now, simply because, especially in the countryside, the state's not only potentially illegitimate, but just doesn't even reach out to the countryside. The road infrastructure is really weak, which might actually be a good thing if you want to protect the isolated areas first. The problem with that is that you can't separate the environmental issues of the countryside from the sort of mega city problems of Port-au-Prince. And so those two might need two different kinds of approaches. And I think the only thing to do with Port-au-Prince is, and this is not at all easy, but to try and decentralize administrative, political, and economic authority of the city itself and build up other towns or cities that might draw some of the population away from Port-au-Prince and make sort of smaller scale cities. That's incredibly hard considering that one of the cities that might have been an option for drawing or absorbing some of the rural migrants, a coastal city called Gonaive, was recently completely destroyed in 2008 by a series of 4 hurricanes. So you're faced with the problem of maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we should just rebuild a whole new city somewhere else now. Of course, again, who's going to do that? There's no state that can do that. The international community is very donor wary in Haiti. It doesn't really want to support imaginative politics or imaginative projects. It wants concrete changes on the ground. And so I think the urban issue is going to be a lot harder to tackle and to find something that could be kind of hopeful to look for. But I think for some parts of the crisis, you could look to the rural community and to community-driven participatory kinds of things. I mean, the real model that I would look to is not for the environment, but that has done this for health services in Haiti incredibly successfully in tackling tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS is Paul Farmer's series of hospitals. Paul Farmer runs a group called Partners in Health in Haiti. He's a doctor and anthropologist from Harvard who's worked in Haiti since the 80s and has now been named vice deputy or second in charge to Bill Clinton, who's a special envoy to Haiti. So there's some sense that he might have the capacity to get people's ears to affect change in Haiti. But he's built from the ground up with the community itself 9 hospitals. They're building a 10th. Partners in Health employs 11,000 people, but only 100 of them are actually American. The rest are doctors and nurses and community health professionals that Partners in Health helps train in Haiti to provide antiretroviral drugs. They go door to door into these rural villages to make sure people are taking their medication. So something like that, which is comprehensive but completely built from the ground up, might be, if you could find, convert that into some sort of cooperative forest system or something like that, I think that might be the kind of thing we should look for. Michael?
Yeah, actually, a lot of questions. I think I'll just ask one. And I'm also sure about a question about hope. It seems to me that, I've been making a long time, and I've been working a long time, but I was especially impressed with this presentation. And I think that, another source of hope is sort of the kind of critical posture that the paper takes up by sort of showing the relationship between these different groups and pointing out that there's really no neutral space. Because it seems to me that going back to the fairness question, one of the problems with the UN or a group like the United Nations is that understood to be neutral, to be objective, to be intervening and stabilizing, quote unquote, the situation. But so the part where we ended in the talk, we talk about sort of the problem with conservation, that it presumes to capture and maintain a space, right? But there's historical transformation underway. So it seems that if indeed there's no neutral space, as you suggest, then people have to be very much clear about the aims and implications of the different ventures and seats undertake. And if we're going to be critical about the industry of it ought to be, that's not just something that Haitians need to do, but people outside of Haiti do as well, right? So it's part of the problem is that people support the UN lining off way. And part of the problem with peacekeeping is sort of when people decide to intervene, how they intervene, when they decide to pull out, how they pull out. And then there's a whole other thing with the UN where other nations pragmatically deploy peacekeeping soldiers for their own democratic position. But so my point, I guess I want to say that sort of being critical about the politics that the UN takes up, that other nations take up around trying to help Haiti, I think is also another source of hope, right? If people around the world were critical about the criteria that's being used to cast the country as a democratic or undemocratic or legitimate or illegitimate, it would, I think, help, because I think Catherine Dello in the group sort of unwittingly were complicit, right, in the framing of the state that other people were developing. I think they honestly meant to do good.
Yeah, I think so.
But they were not critical enough about what makes a government legitimate and who gets to decide when they decide what might be part of the decision-making process.
Yeah, and especially because their goal ended up becoming saving this space. And as if we just save it, then we've solved this problem. I absolutely think they had the best intentions, but they did internalize a particular model of the state and being promoted both in Haiti and outside of Haiti for that is itself its own kind of commitment to things like policing and security as public goods. I mean, essentially, they internalized, without knowing it, a kind of neoliberal mentality, its own kind of utopianism in a sense, and that a state should just provide security and open up markets, and democracy will follow. I mean, this is by and large what Haiti's been left with, if anything, as a kind of model to follow. I would think many people in Haiti who work on the environment would agree with me that you must address both the urban crisis and the rural crisis, and they might need different solutions. And I think the rural one needs a revival of agriculture and the peasantry, but the UN and the US, the international community as a whole, rejects that as something to be committed to. Haiti is a net food importer, mostly of US food, and I think that rebuilding a kind of national agricultural space or economy would be seen as violating the free market mentality of the Caribbean and Latin America as a whole. So Haiti has suffered from that long-term sort of structural adjustment policy, the Washington Consensus, the neoliberalization of Latin America and the Caribbean. It's really suffered from a lot of that. I think that I would argue exactly what you're saying, that one of the things we need to do in thinking about sustainability and trying to enact sustainability is both have particular kinds of spatial forms or institutions that we seek to build, whether it's a neighborhood or a park or a garden or whatever else it might be. But I think also a part of that must be a theory of society. That we have to contain it has to contain a theory of society. And in that sense, I would argue even more strongly that any theories of society that will do for this must be critical of the contradictions of society itself. In this case, being critical of things like trying to make a public good out of a privately owned space anyway would have been the first critical move that the Dunham Foundation never really took up. They didn't really ever question the fact that the property, I didn't mention this today, but for those of you in the class, you heard a little bit about this, they never critically engaged with the fact that the property used to be the estate of Haiti's #1 villain in terms of its history, General Charles Leclerc, Napoleon Bonaparte's brother-in-law, who was sent to the French colony of Saint-Domingue to end the Haitian Revolution by capturing its leader, Toussaint Louverture. And so the property is infamous in the country as this is rooted in the colonial past. And so they never questioned that link or Dunham's private ownership of it or how this estate never got broken up in the first place by when all the other estates in the country got broken up in the 19th century. And so I absolutely think we need to have a kind of commitment to social theory and critical social theory. And the UN as well needs to be critiqued. It's not, in Haiti itself, it's, most Haitians now joke that the UN's doing nothing except going to the beach and drinking beer. And it's hard to find other things that they are doing. I mean, they're there providing security, but that's about it. And a lot of people fear that the UN's going to just become something that drags on forever and ever. It's got no mission by which we would decide when it would end. Right? And so, is it just going to last for 25 years? How long is it going to be there? Is it going to be permanent? And in Haiti, a country based on a revolution that kicked out a colonial force, having a foreign military is fairly, shall we say, anathema to Haitian nationalism. Right? It's not called a UN mission by Haitians. It's called the third U.S. occupation of Haiti. The first one was in 1915 to 1934 when the U.S. actually occupied Haiti. The second one was a UN mission in 94 to put Aristide back in place. And this one, the U.S. has no direct role in leading the UN, but is seen as the U.S. sending its, in Haiti they say the U.S. sent its lapdogs to do its work. So there's a lot of critique within Haiti about the UN, and actually a direct resistance to working with them by some people in Haiti. Yeah.
I was wondering what the system of education is like there right now, and whether there's been any effort to instate sort of like a way that they can teach the people of Haiti about how they relate to their environment and how they can use their environment to save themselves rather than like giving them free things or occupying.
Yeah, the educational system's broken like any other kind of public service fairly significantly. There's ostensibly public education provided by the state, but in rural areas, most of those schools don't run all the time. Haiti has two official languages, French and Creole, or Haitian. Everybody speaks Creole, and only a small percentage of the population speaks French. Most of the education is still run in French, so there's a kind of just exclusion of people. I mean, they're just being talked at in another language in the class. And then there's just the demands of labor within the family. It means a lot of students have to pull out of school at a fairly young age. And while it's ostensibly free in the public school system, you have to pay for books and uniforms to go to the school. So there's a lot. School itself, in September, when school starts, families have been saving all summer to try and get one of their kids, the one who's been the best at school so far, enrolled. And then if anything happens along the way, any small step, if they don't sell enough onions at the market that year, they have to draw their kid out. And so it's a real sort of balancing act just to get for people to just stay in school. There's a whole system of private schools that are completely unregulated. You can attend them year after year, and they'll give you a degree, but you don't know how to read or write or do anything. I mean, they're completely unchecked in terms of the standards. They just take your money and give you a certificate at the end. So that's been a problem, especially in the city. There are a couple of schools that wanted to build sites in the garden, and one of them took some kids on a tour of the site when I was working there in 2003, and it ended badly. We were kicked off the property by the Red Army. So we had the next day they were sort of middle class kids. I mean, from a fairly good school in Port-au-Prince. They were fascinated by the site and really interested in the environment. But the next day, the school had all the parents calling saying, "You took my kids to a place where a gang attacked them." I mean, they didn't really attack us, but it got out of control. And so that really ended any commitment to a sort of merger between the garden and schools in this particular case. But I think that by and large, what was the concern for this grassroots group in Martezat, the Cooperative Society for the Environment, was protect the watershed, provide education. Those were the two things they really wanted to do for precisely the reason that you're suggesting, that they felt that on one level, everyone in Haiti knows you cut down fruit trees is a problem, but teaching ways in which one could manage reforestation campaigns or protect resources was seen as a necessary component for education. It's just not there yet. I mean, there is an agronomy school which teaches more technical management of resources, but that's about it, and that's sort of small and not a huge component of the educational system.
Time for one last question.
Great.
Any last questions?
Yes, I have a question. I'm sorry I missed the conversation, so you may have mentioned that, but I still want to ask you. You talk about us helping some different way in the US, some different way in the US, some different way in the French or whatever, certainly not colonizing or whatever. How do you think this is coming from education themselves? Because some do manage to get through the school system, to go to good schools, university abroad afterwards, so have you managed to see something developing there?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of Haitians committed to the project that I was working on, and there's been a problem of a kind of brain drain in Haiti in the past few decades because most people left, most of the intellectual and professional class, people who would have gone to university left Haiti from the 60s to the mid-80s or 90s under the dictatorship and the military junta. So convincing them to come back is a key issue, absolutely, and I think that would be necessary as well to a kind of, not just to building the state's capacity, but to building the nation's capacity, having this sector of kind of intellectuals that could come and expand and teach in the university system as well as run these kinds of projects. It hasn't really happened because, if you leave your homeland in say 1960, fleeing a dictatorship, and you expect to go back, and that dictatorship drags on for 2.5 more decades, and then you think about going back, but suddenly there's a military junta that's killing everybody, or you think about going back and
sorry to interrupt you, but it's not wrong that you're describing it. I did work with the prioritization committee when mentioning prioritization of water. It was attempted a few times. I did work for that, water and other utilities. Last time in 1999, it had been attempted a couple of times before, and I'm sure it was attempted back too as well. There were very educated people, usually they get their engineering degree in France, and their MBA in the US. And they were ready to stay there for $5,000 a month. They would stay there because we could afford them a nice house. The issue we're facing were political. There were political issues, internal political. The UAD, the world I was working for, it was political inside. You had 100 political parties. I mean, it was just not working politically from the inside. So I think something coming from there.
I'm not sure I understand the end part of your question. I mean, yes, I've been talking about the political crisis through the whole talk, yeah.
From inside the country, wanting to change something?
Yeah, there's lots of people who want to change things in the country, absolutely, yes. And the state just doesn't have the capacity to channel that desire or that community that might make that happen into action. Right? That's what you're talking about in terms of the blockage of the multiple political parties or a political crisis. I mean, the state is absolutely a key part of the problem, and one of the things I've been talking about throughout is that the way the Botanic Garden project was framed, and I think the sort of utility of this as a case study also points to the fact that this is both the crisis itself, whether it's environmental or political or social in Haiti, is both, it's produced by both contradictions in the world system as a whole, including things like the international political community, but not just that. And it's produced by internal contradictions in Haitian society, absolutely. And the main one that I've been emphasizing is the state's incapacity, the state's weakness, but it's not just that.